Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of the book you see in front of you, Custom Air Suspension. What I want to do in today's video is cover the setup of the air suspension in one of my cars. And we'll start by looking at the front springs. These are rolling lobe air springs that have been mounted on struts. At the back, you'll see another pair of rolling lobe air springs. These are Firestone off-the-shelf air springs. And normally covered by the rear bumper cover is a compressor and a tank. The compressor is from a BMW X5 and the tank is from a Porsche Cayenne. And you might wonder why I'm using such expensive components. They're actually cheaper than aftermarket components if you buy them secondhand, and of course they're excellent original equipment quality. But what I really want to concentrate on is the setup of the system. This is the front system. So you have the left spring and you have the right spring. Notice how each of these springs has an accumulator that's plumbed into it. An accumulator is just a small sealed reservoir. What the accumulators do is they increase the volume of air acting within the spring, and that softens the rate. The two front springs I thought were rather too stiff for the handling that I was after, and adding an accumulator in this way softens the rate. The bigger the hose you can get between the accumulator and the spring, the better. Unfortunately, many manufacturers of especially aftermarket air springs aren't aware that you can soften spring rate in this way, and they don't provide you with big enough fittings. But any diameter fitting is better than none. And if I just jump to the next shot briefly, here are the air accumulators. They happen to be mounted in the engine bay. That was the easiest place to put them. And these are plumbed to those front springs to soften the spring rate. All right, so that explains the two accumulators. Now let's have a look at how we inflate the springs. The air passes through a restriction, a small orifice, to the up left solenoid, which then goes to the left spring, and goes to the up right solenoid that then goes to the right spring, as you would expect. The down solenoid and right solenoid and the down left solenoid are also feeding out through here. Why do I put a restriction in there? Well, I don't want the air springs to inflate really fast. I'm not interested in having the car leap off the ground. And if I'm adjusting ride height as the car is being driven, which is very frequently the case, I don't want any change in steering geometry or anything like that, not to happen quickly anyway, so I inflate and deflate the springs relatively slowly, perhaps 5 or 10 seconds to make a change in height. Why isn't there a restriction on the outlet? That restriction is actually incorporated into the compressor, which we'll look at in a moment. So the use of 4 solenoids, the 2 front springs obviously are controlled individually, and each of them has an accumulator. There they are again, those accumulators that are under the bonnet, under the hood. The back of the car have a quite different system. So firstly, the 2 springs, the left spring and the right spring, are controlled as a pair. If we look at the up solenoid, when that's open, the air passes through the restriction. It can then pass to the left spring and it can then pass to the right spring via these little manifolds, which are yellow here. Down solenoid also act in this case through the restriction. Now, the tricky bit is this line here that connects the left and the right springs. This is a front-wheel drive car, and it's the rear springs that are interconnected in this way, or when that solenoid is shut, the springs are connected only through this restriction. So what you're saying? Well, if you connect the springs together with the solenoid open, the rear roll stiffness is reduced. So on slippery conditions, on dirt, on wet roads, no snow where I live, but if there were snow here, that would be the case as well. I flick a switch, a driver switch, it opens the solenoid and the rear roll stiffness is reduced, so there's less oversteer. When I want to drive the car harder and the road is dry, the conditions are good, I close that solenoid, greater rear roll stiffness, so the front wheel drive car turns in more readily, has a little bit of throttle lift off oversteer. So the idea you can change the roll stiffness by simply operating a solenoid valve is one which is very useful in the real world, but very few people, if any, appear to actually do that. Here's the compressor and the supply system. The compressor, the X5 compressor I showed you earlier, includes a desiccant dryer, so it dries the air. That passes then through a one-way valve. I have a second filter dryer just to be absolutely sure. pressurizes the tank. I've fitted the tank with a little drain at one end. You'll notice the tank wasn't perfectly horizontal, it was tilted down at that end. However, in action, the desiccant dryer in the compressor, the X5 compressor, it works so well that I never have any water in the tank whatsoever. So it then feeds a manifold, and that manifold feeds a nice loud air horn. Why wouldn't you have an air horn if you've got air suspension? Feeds the front springs, feeds the rear springs. There's a relief valve there, an emergency overpressure release valve. There's a pressure switch that I use to operate the compressor through a solid state relay. And there's a pressure sensor so I can read on my electronic dash what the system pressure actually is. Now, up here, important. The air return coming from the springs does not dump straight to atmosphere. It passes through a one-way valve. It connects to the outlet of the compressor, and the compressor, the BMW X5 compressor, and most factory air suspension compressors are the same, is designed to feed that outflowing air back through the desiccant dryer and dry that out again. So that's why it never gets saturated, because it is dried by the return airflow flowing through it. So when you have a BMW X5 or a Mercedes compressor or a Porsche compressor, they're all very, very similar, Range Rover compressor, then you can automatically use that dryer to dry the air that's going through your system. That means less rust in exposed damper shafts, things of that sort. Less water flowing around the system is good in any respect. The book's called Custom Air Suspension, How to Install Air Suspension in Your Road Car on a Budget. It's a book very much aimed at people who want to give their car the best ride and handling. And of course, as we saw, being able to interconnect two springs at one end of the car allows you to change roll stiffness at that end of the car. That can be really useful as a handling aid that you can adjust very easily as the driver simply by flicking a switch. Custom Air Suspension, it's out now. Thank you.